The Winter Latina Show.
Hosted by Idea.
And we should be live. Everything's about okay. In YouTube, I still have the countdown. Is it correct? Oh, yeah, it's correct. So we are live, yes. Hello, Nina. Hello, everybody.
Welcome,
We're back
everyone.
to the Winter
Welcome
Latina
back
show.
to episode 3 of the most popular show in the universe, Wishful Thinking, but eventually I intend for it to be so.
No,
just
it's
for
so
this
popular that the Putin is watching us.
I know that's the only thing, right? Having that kind of validation at the interior level is what's really important to me, and this is why I'm sporting a dark Mordor T-shirt, right? You can see it says Moscow. It's in black and white. It looks really dark. It looks really terrifying, much like many Western leaders wanted you to think about Russia. And yeah, we kind of mulled about whether or not to discuss the most recent Putin interview, because of course by now it's been a week, but there's a lot to say, even though lots of people have discussed it already. And what we have is the benefit of the tyrant's, I'm using air quote, own reaction to his own interview that has sort of been making rounds. I watched clips of it this morning. So we can sort of use that as a starting point, and we can talk about some other issues that have come up. What do you think, Marcelo? Tech genius, Marcelo.
No tech genius. Everything as usual started with chaos, but it's perfect now, it seems like. I think it's a great idea to do a react over the reaction
to a reaction, exactly. It's like those YouTube videos of reacting to people reacting to music. And yeah, it's basically that same thing, except in politics. So it's more offensive. But you know, this is what we do. This is the realm in which we are in. Have you had the chance to watch Putin's reaction to the to his own
reaction of the reaction? Yes, I watched this. It was about 15 minutes video that I took a look. And actually very, very interesting things. So first of all, I think was very interesting that he said that he didn't enjoy the interview with Tucker.
He did not enjoy the interview. He said that he really wanted it to be more confrontational, and that's what he prepared for. Now, of course, he could just be making it up, but what he goes on to say later sounds like sort of prepared statements that he wanted to make previously about various Western leaders. So it does sound to me like this is actually what he wanted to do. But the quote that I liked, one of the quotes was, quote, surprisingly for a Western journalist, he, the interviewer, turned out to be patient and he listened to my lengthy monologues, especially about history. So it's really kind of hilarious that he recognizes the extent to which he has the tendency to sort of steamroll over certain journalists, especially ones that are not screaming over him and that listen and are sort of prepared to listen to the so-called lengthy monologues about history. And of course, I'm also a person who does the said monologues because that's one of my areas of interest. It used to be an area of my academic specialization, so it's very relatable, and I know it's relatable to a lot of other people. Some are sort of self-described nerds, some are not, but it's definitely interesting. And what I thought was interesting, specifically about history, and we can go back to the reaction in a moment, was that there's this whole Kremlinology spectrum that these so-called experts, many of whom either do not speak Russian or have never been to Russia, nonetheless, they have really strong opinions. And usually these opinions are negative because that's what they're either getting paid for or this is what they are, getting off of on. But it was really funny because on the one hand, some people were saying that Putin is really boring because he went into this historic lecture. He's just boring. He can't get to the point. He has to make this, this long introduction until he makes his point. And then the other end of the spectrum said that, well, he's actually very mediocre because he's really just quoting a 9th grade Russian history textbook. And of course, my question is that if that is the level of a 9th grade history textbook in Russia, what does that tell you about the history textbook in your country? Probably not at the same level. Probably not at the same level. So it's kind of like this unintentional self-defeatism on the part of these criminologists is really hilarious, in my opinion.
Yeah, just yesterday I was having a live with a Portuguese guy, Ricardo Nuno, who is the Geopol PT on Twitter, and I was talking about him. I was talking about this thing. I think I mentioned this with you before, that by Russian and or ex-Soviet friends that I have, and from different levels, from PhD in high energy physics to people that work with construction
worker. Yeah,
exactly. They have the basic level of instruction is extremely high in my view. To why I'm used in Brazil, of course, and maybe even if you go around in Europe, that's more or less you're gonna see much less knowledge of history. And let me just a second restart your video because I think it's lagging a little bit. And in Instagram, looks all right, but here it was a bit laggy and a bit shady. I don't know why.
Is it back on?
It looks better now. So that was one of my first things that I.
And now, believe it or not, it's actually many people would claim that the level of instruction is worse than it had been in the Soviet Union. Now, of course, there was the prism of class struggle applied to certain historic events. In my opinion, in some cases, it was sort of taken over the top, but nonetheless, the level of information was extraordinary. And, I still remember certain dates from Russian history from back when I was, I'm not sure, maybe in 5th grade, which I don't have such memories from, going to high school in Canada and learning Canadian history, for instance. So, yeah, I would say, again, very...
And it should be much shorter.
Right. Very, very anecdotally, I think the level of instruction in history is better in Europe, certainly better than in North America. At least in my experience, both in the US and Canada, sort of global history is usually an elective. I mean, there might be some exceptions. And then it sort of evens out. There's a big jump between university and high school. But of course, the way, the history of certain countries outside of the rules-based order, quote unquote, air quotes, very heavy air quotes, is being presented is through a heavy propagandistic prism. So there's also that type of thing to consider as well. But at least in terms of factual information, dates and names, I would say North America is way, way, way below. Europe is sort of higher up. Maybe some countries are better than others. And then I would say Russia is higher, although not as good as back in the Soviet days. And I would say, depending on where in, for instance, East Asia, let's say high school, China, they definitely look at the history of the Soviet Union, for instance, and their level of knowledge is quite high. So it's definitely that gap in sort of public school education is pretty significant. And some may claim that it informs people's perception later on, the way they sort of absorb media and information about certain countries, especially if it's being presented through a certain prism of heavy propaganda, right? So that's another thing to consider here. But I think the most obvious thing about the Putin interview was, the so-called Streisand effect, when if you don't want something to be heard, you ignore it. If you're going to pump it up by telling people not to watch it, even people who had no interest in it are going to check it out just because it's the forbidden fruit. It's just such an obvious thing. That's why I don't really understand these European and North American and Western, official Western, again, leaders, I know it's a loaded term, they have all this supposedly advice, very professional advice coming from their political science analysts, et cetera, but they're still doing something so moronic by going on camera repeatedly and telling people not to watch this thing. And of course, even people who have no interest in this, are just going to be curious and check it out and perhaps even learn something from it. So that kind of blows my mind. It actually kind of reminds me of the RT ban in the EU, right? Where it was banned, and then people just jumped on their VPNs, including people who didn't really have much interest in RT. And RT is good. It has its own issues. It's sort of beyond the content of this episode. But you would talk to, again, very anecdotally, you talk to people who had no interest in RT, but now are checking it out because it's this proverbial forbidden fruit. They want to know why this content is no longer accessible to them, against the backdrop of we live in this wonderful, universal values society of freedom, democracy, and all the other keywords, in freedom of speech, of course, to a certain extent, but at the same time, you cannot access this media from a foreign country, even though you're bombarded with media from sort of the designated echo chamber. So yeah, it's really kind of interesting, that opposite effect that the prescription of do not watch it had, which is so obvious. Again, it blows my mind. What do you think about that?
I think that's so. We did a react in the IDM channel here for the Brazilians, and I said a lot of things. So first of all, I really enjoyed the interview. First of all, it was very factual, and that's very rare nowadays. And the Putin, for example, he mentions that. Actually, Tucker first mentioned this, that in the beginning he was, rushing up things, and then Putin was a little annoyed, and then he was annoyed. Yeah, but at some point, I think they got the tune of the interview. And so Tucker got his tune, the Putin got his tune, and he controlled the interview.
Because neither one expected what they got. One wanted more of a Western-style interview where you have quick sound bites, as opposed to this kind of more of an old-school interview. Right, exactly, where you have an old-school interview where you actually give the subject a chance to respond and elaborate, which doesn't happen much anymore. I mean, sometimes it does. And the other one, of course, was expecting something more hostile. At least that's what that's what Putin claimed, and he had his prepared talking points, and then that didn't happen.
For me, it looks like the love dance. One was testing the other,
right?
And at some point, no, really, Putin was testing his patience. It was clear that he was testing his patience and expecting exactly what a Western journalist do, that is getting impatient. And then he was, okay, now that you're
I think it's important to mention that unlike a lot of Western leaders, Putin has had many, many, many interviews with hostile journalists over the years. Before the Ukraine crisis, during the Ukraine crisis. So he's not really, it's not a new thing to him he actually allows this. And if you think about Western leaders, they're not really keen on having long interviews with, I don't know, someone from RT, for instance, or Sputnik, right? So there's also that contrast. But, again, you kind of have to think of this in context because, Putin did a long interview with, another American, Megyn Kelly, a few years ago, was a long interview. So there are sort of other precedents. And I don't necessarily think this was sort of his best interview, because I've heard much of what he said before, and lots of other people have said, well, he's mentioned all of these things. But of course, this was more about the audience and the reach and the impact because of this whole campaign around it, even though he has done interviews of this nature before. Now, he did mention some things that may have been new, given a bit more information about his communication with leaders from other countries over the years. And, he's very careful about not to reveal too much, because if something was being said in private, he doesn't really want to betray the level of trust that he may or may not have had anymore with some of these leaders, right? So that's another thing to consider.
He actually just remembered. Oh, remember that I went to talk to Bush this year and that year. It was published by you, by your media. I mean, the American media. So he was not actually throwing new bombs or anything like that. He was just, you should know that it's there. You did it. You knew it, and I think. So I think he tested the patient of Tucker very, very well. And I think point Tucker just said, okay, this is the best way to conduct this. If I go further, he will get bored because, as you mentioned, this interview some years ago was a terrible interview. You can see that Putin was completely uncomfortable to a point that it looked like he wanted to take off his shoes and throw in the guy's face. I mean, it was really terrible thing. And the first thing that I commented in the channel was that I thought he was very relaxed at this interview. He was very, I'm just doing this. This is normal.
This is why I was surprised by seeing the clips of the interviewer saying that he seemed angry at certain things. His eyes flashed. I didn't really see any of that because he is sort of known as someone who is stone cold in public in terms of controlling his emotions, never reacting immediately, including to very, very difficult situations in the escalation in the war and prior to the war. He never seems to respond right away. It's very sort of weighed responses, whether it's his intelligence training, whether it's his legal training. He kind of has this sort of very measured, objective, legalistic, can't even speak today, judicial attitude towards these things. So I kind of thought he was quite relaxed and he was in control and he wanted to, like I said, he has the tendency of, well, he's a leader, right? He's used to he's used to having people do what he tells them to do as a leader. I mean, that's not surprising. So I also think he's really very much in control because he has done, he does his annual communication with ordinary Russians, right? That his this could last for 4 hours, where every year people call in or video call in, right? Or send messages in advance. And people say, well, some of it is prepared. Well, of course it's filtered because he gets millions of pieces of information and they choose which ones to respond, which ones not to respond. But there are also sometimes things that come up in these annual communications with the voters, whatever you want to call it, the ordinary people in Russia. They're not always positive things that are being said. And so he's used to a certain level of impromptu communication in that format, even if some messages are being screened, which of course they would be, because again, they're going through millions of messages. I mean, there was one time where I tried to get through to ask a question that pertained to something that pertained to a family member of mine who lives in, and I didn't. Putin, if you're listening, I need some help. But anyway, so we know he's listening because he's on the same page as us historically.
Yeah, just before the interview came out to the air, we made a show that basically he cut and paste from what we saw. So
he basically stole all my taglines with my he's basically vicariously living through my Western history PhD, which I'm not using in the academia because I despise it. But yeah, he basically stole all my taglines. I'm just kidding. Please don't come after me. But it's really interesting how Yeah, it's been revived. The Soviet intelligence agency has been revived. Yeah, so my perception was also different. I didn't see any eyes flashing. I saw the sort of very focused, stone cold, statistical, because he is known for having immense amounts of information in his mind, which I don't know how that's even possible, on various subjects. He can talk about statistics about Russian trade. He can then go into some, historical event that happened 700 years ago. He's going to give you some very specific information about that. So he's kind of known for that as well, which I think is an interesting point. That was a takeaway from a lot of Western viewers too. They said, I don't really necessarily like this guy, but I like the fact that he knows this much about his country. Who right now in the official West, specifically this was Europeans, who in Europe knows this much about the country that he or she represents? I mean, I'm not sure. Maybe someone like, the Hungarian leader, Viktor Orban, possibly. I've never seen, such a long interview, but possibly because he seems to be focused on, in some ways, Hungary first type politics. But beyond that, I can't think of a single leader that would have that much information accessible and would be that knowledgeable. And I think that really was, a striking contrast between what they have versus what Russians have. And perhaps that was one of the reasons why some people did not want the level of attention that the interview ended up getting, even though I don't think it was his, best interview ever. So.
Yeah, no. I mean, it was probably not the best. It was a good one for a Western style. It was unimaginable.
Right.
And one thing that I think even Andrei Martyanov, when he reacted to the interview, one thing that the name of the video is like Tucker wiped the floor with Hillary and the mainstream media. So the thing was that even Tucker was very smart on this part. He held the interview to a level of curiosity where it was completely viral everywhere. It was not just, it came to the air and people freak out and say, oh, no, don't listen to the guy. Beforehand, I mean, like days before, they were freaking out on CNN, on everywhere. Hillary gave an interview calling Tucker the idiot, useful idiot.
Useful idiot, yeah.
They were freaking out. So that was, it just came yesterday. I think it reached 1 billion views. This is absolutely probably unprecedented.
Yeah, this is like a pop star level viewership on these popular social media platforms, which is very, very different from your typical Western leader for sure. So
yeah, we're almost getting there. We just need 900 and
right. Just a few. Maybe we should release some metal to a metal collaboration, since we both like metal, and then that'll play into the whole rock star factor, and then we can get more views. So that could be one trajectory.
I'll start to create live streams for 5 days, say interview with Xi Jinping, and maybe they freak out beforehand, and I get 1 million views. I don't know.
Right. And then the China's leader doesn't show up because he's like, I don't do this.
Yeah, no, he had a problem last minute. I mean,
right, exactly. Yeah. So I
think
go ahead.
it was interesting this react that he did. He also, he extended the interview. He went, okay, we went to this point, and then there was these things that I wanted to talk about, and he threw up the Blinken situation, the ancestors from Blinken that came from Kyiv.
Well, why don't you tell the viewers what that was about? I thought it was really.
Exactly.
He always seems to refer. It's the joke is that because he had his intelligence training, he goes to the archives to get the information on the person he's talking about. So it's very precise. So you can tell them what that information was.
Yeah, exactly. So the information was that Blinken was talking about his ancestors, his Jew ancestors that fled the old Soviet Union, or not even Soviet Union at the time, the Russian Empire at the time. And they fled to America because of the pogrom of the Jews. But so first of all, the thing was that the pogrom started at 1905, and they fled on 1904. So they kind of fled
that was a not so subtle jab. Yeah, that it was a year prior to the actual event, which was interesting. But the other one was that all the ones that were major happened to have happened in what today is modern Ukraine. And so what Putin was saying, either you talk about this as Ukraine, or you don't acknowledge that there was a Ukraine at this time because you keep referring to it as Russia.
Exactly.
So why, what is the purpose of you for doing that? Is that because you want to engage in a propaganda campaign against Russia by talking about these awful incidents, or it's a sort of like the puzzle doesn't quite, what is that expression? Math isn't mathing. So yeah, the math isn't mathing here. 1904, 1905, it was the Russian Empire, but actually it was the Ukrainian territory. But we're not going to talk about the fact that it was in the Ukrainian territory because that doesn't make modern Ukraine look good. So we're going to sort of try to tweak bits and pieces where it sounds believable and plausible, but the archives say, archives kind of reveal the true extent of what had happened. And so it was also interesting when he talked about the way the Russian government intervened in the pogroms, because of course they didn't want that inter-ethnic strife. He talked about the sort of people's militias that were trying to put a stop to this, which was also not something that's mentioned in Western or in some Western sources, that there were people, militias that were trying to put an end to this, these pogroms, et cetera, et cetera. So that's interesting. So the fact that Putin brought this up in his reaction to his own interview does tell you that there's probably some truth to the fact that he wanted to bring all this stuff up in the original interview. He didn't get to it, but he really, really prepared. So he told this Russian interviewer instead. And then, of course, he took major jabs at the German foreign minister, Annalena, who can tell 360 degrees from 180 degrees. And, he talked about it. I thought that was also a great point because, the German media released all this information that one of her ancestors was a major functionary
or whatever. Yeah.
Right, exactly, during the period of Nazi Germany. And the interviewer actually didn't like this question because I don't think it's he said, do you think Germans have something having to do with Nazism at a genetic level? And of course, that sounds like anti-Russian propaganda. I'm not sure if the interviewer was deliberately asking this kind of question to sound very over the top, but I didn't like that question at all. But of course, then Putin responded by saying that we shouldn't really be judging all modern Germans by, basically the sins of their forefathers. We should be looking at very specific events and very specific information. And of course, he was probably insinuating the support of the German government, which is one of the biggest supporters of the modern day Ukrainian state. And we know that state has been glorifying certain collaborators at the level of renaming streets, putting up new statues, holding parades, et cetera, et cetera. So there was that, kind of an undercurrent, which was obvious to those who've been following the conflict in Ukraine for the past almost decade now. This April, it'll be a decade, which is really kind of crazy to think about that. But yeah, it was kind of interesting where he said something that, people have been sort of accusing him, saying, oh, this whole denazification, it's so stupid, it's just an excuse. And the fact that they probably would have expected him to say, yes, we should be thinking of Germans as Nazis. And it's completely not what he said. He was completely reasonable by saying, no, we should not be judging all of Germans by the sins of their ancestors, nor should we be judging all of the Germans by the acts of their government.
Exactly.
Well.
One thing also that the Putin always, he's very subtle on this controversial subject. So he doesn't go to the confrontation. He always keep the door open for a diplomatic understanding of the situation. So one of the things that he mentioned to Tucker. Tucker at some point, now reacting to the interview, Tucker at some point looked at him and said that the mustache Germany is gone, and it's not possible to see it because the camera is on the back. But Putin actually laughs when he says that. He says that, and Putin goes like,
right.
He hasn't.
Well, we also know
Putin. Like that.
He's also a huge Germanophile. I think it is probably this one aspect of the dissolution of the relationship between Russia and Europe. He's also, a fan of Europe, not the West, but Europe, continental Europe. Let's be more specific, not the UK, but continental Europe. So the big countries, much like, that also kind of matches my own perceptions as far as, their government's actions are concerned. So I think as someone who is fluent in German, as someone who has studied, Germany, who has lived there, et cetera, he has this really positive attitude toward Germany. He knows a lot. So the fact that there's that particular, and he's had good relations with previous German leaders that I would say were much wiser than today's leaders. And of course, some of them have essentially been, kicked out from German public life, like, Gerhard Schroeder or something like that, because how dare he travel to Moscow? How dare he, go to some of these events and, whatever else has been doing. So it's that particular part of it has probably been disappointing to Putin personally because of, so like I'm a Japanophile. So if the current Japanese-Russian relations are not very pleasing to me. And so I can kind of understand how he would feel. I'm not a political leader, obviously. I'm just a famous YouTuber. I'm just a famous Twitter public figure. But you know what I'm saying, right? I'm just a normal person. I'm not a leader who's had that type of communication. But I think that aspect of it, with specifically Germany, is probably quite disappointing. The dissolution of and the backstabbing with the Minsk agreements, specifically with Merkel, with whom he seemed to have had, she sort of seemed to be, even though she was problematic, she seemed to be the last, maybe not great, but you know what I'm saying, sort of a higher level German leader as opposed to the present day leadership, which is just like nothing. Nothing is there.
You may like or dislike whatever she was doing to Germany, but the truth is that she was a much more strong leader than whatever
absolutely.
You have today. Well, you don't have a leadership today. You have,
Well, I think the
Scholz.
former Ukrainian ambassador's insults about Scholz being a liver sausage, sulking liver sausage. I think it's actually, it's obviously very rude and it's not diplomatic for an ambassador to speak this way, but at the same time, there is a kernel of truth, because Scholz is it's like an empty seat of a bureaucrat that another bureaucrat can replace, and no one will ever even realize that has been replaced. Unlike Merkel. Again, I think Merkel was problematic for many reasons, but she was, like you're saying, a strong leader. So I think that particular backstabbing with the Minsk agreement was definitely something that would have been taken seriously on maybe a more personal level because of his interest in Germany.
Yeah, and as we say here in the channel every now and then, is marry someone that looks to you as Putin looks to Merkel. It kind of looks like something happened there at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever seen that Merkel actually smiling? That's.
I think there are all these. We used to share not memes. They're actual photographs, because Putin is sort of more of a traditional gentleman in line with Russian culture, where every time he met a female political leader, he would bring flowers, a bouquet of flowers, because in Russia, it's very common to give flowers for any and every occasion. You might arrive at an airport from a trip, your family member or friend will gift you flowers, right? Not just a birthday or some super special event. So there are, pictures of him with Merkel giving her flowers. And yes, she's smiling from ear to ear, because I don't think she, in a very sort of masculine world of politics at the highest level of power, I don't think she was used to being treated as a sort of a woman, quote unquote, in a more traditional way. So I think that the smile was genuine, and you see that with other leaders as well. So it's really kind of funny from that perspective too.
Yeah. So that brings me to, of course, the one quote that I thought it was very interesting, that he mentioned the anti-mustache movement, that it should be global, not just Russia doing the hard work on its lands, but the entire planet should start moving in that direction.
This is why every once in a while Russia brings out the resolution to combat the rise of Nazism, and there's always United States, Ukraine, and maybe a couple of other smaller vassal countries that vote against. Well, no, some Europeans do. Some European countries, since the escalation of the conflict, vote against it as well, or refrain from, or abstain basically from participating. So I think it's also very, very telling. Of course, they would accuse Russia of doing this for propaganda purposes. But, I would say with the types of things that we have seen in modern Ukraine, right? It doesn't apply to every single person who lives in Ukraine, but that sort of undercurrent of pseudo-nationalist or far, extreme nationalist thugs is definitely there. And it's definitely been one of the factors that brought in the regime change government has kept it in place. And so you can't sort of ignore that particular aspect of it. So when people say that Putin is exaggerating the whole denazification, I feel like they're sort of ignoring their own media's reports on this type of information from pre-2022. We mentioned this before. But another thing that this kind of makes me think of, again, you kind of have these commentators from the insane Kremlinology spectrum where they say, well, which one is it? Was it the NATO expansion? Was it the Donbass situation? Was it the denazification? And it's like, well, why can't all of these factors be relevant? Why can't we look at this from, zoom out, right? Look at the big picture and say some factors were more relevant than others, but it doesn't mean that one has to negate the other. And that's the thing that never makes sense to me. So, in this reaction to the reaction and Putin's reaction to his own interview, again, it's really funny to say because he's really wanted to get this out. You can really tell. You guys should go and watch it. And he talked about this. He said, I never said that NATO expansion was the direct result. It was the direct cause, the direct immediate cause for the launch of the special military operation. The reason, he says, in his opinion, he brought it up was to show sort of the level of disregarding Russia's national security interests, starting from the not an inch eastward lines. And obviously, he acknowledges that nothing was signed. But, if you look at the Minsk agreements, those were signed. So what use were they if they were signed and ratified and they still, according to Merkel and Poroshenko and the French leader, right? If they were not actually going to be adhered to. Mm-hmm.
When I think about this, I mean, look, countries. So people think or should think that the UN is some kind of a global law or something like that, but the reality is that countries are sovereign in their lands. So when you have it's very difficult to put this type of law bending narrative that because what the United States say on its side is that we promise we will not expand NATO, but that's not signing the paper. So whatever, and the fact is that it's the country word. The other side, there's nothing that will bend this to the law of the country. It's a bilateral treaty. We're not going to you don't need to have it in the paper. You have the word.
Of course. But like I said, the Minsk agreement was on paper. So what use did that paper have? Zero, like toilet paper. That was pretty much the use of it. So, you can also make this argument. But another thing, it's just common sense. If you're going to be moving a large modern army and weapon systems closer and closer to someone else's borders, at some point, they're going to respond. And had it been another country, they would have responded, a powerful country, we know which country that is, they would have responded much sooner. And I know the argument here, which I think the sort of well-meaning people make, is saying like, oh, what if we put, what if North Korea or whoever outside of the Western establishment carried out a regime change in Mexico and Canada and put weapons there. I think it's not a bad analogy, but you need to take it farther. I'm not going to use the United States because I'm a Russian living in North America. Let's take France. You need to take it one step farther. You need to go to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So let's imagine France. I don't actually want France to fall apart, caveat. Imagine France falling apart per the regions that exist there. And imagine one of the regions is now a separate country and it has a regime change and a hostile power puts weapons there. This is how you should be perceiving it, not a country like the US, whatever, has Mexico and Canada with regime changes. No, you need to go one step farther, that the Soviet Union fell apart and lands that were historically Russian were now attached to someone else, with the people. It's not just the land, that's the important part, but the people. So I think those analogies work, but they need to be taken to sadly, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and then it's going to make more sense. But the other thing here, again, is going to the expansion of NATO. If you go back to maybe, if you were sort of been watching how that has been playing out and the sort of gradual increase of hostilities and Russia being poked and poked and poked to see, are they going to respond now? Are they going to respond now? No, they have no balls. They're going to do nothing. If you go back, I remember it was maybe around 2015 or so, they were having all these NATO training things 300 meters from the Russian border in Estonia. Putin didn't send the Russian army, into little tiny Chihuahua, Estonia. So if that was the argument, he would have done so if it was a solely NATO expansion. So clearly something else was happening too. That's something else being the Donbass situation, for instance. So, it's just like, I don't understand why people have to separate a single cause or a single factor when you have a dynamic political situation that is changing, and you have multiple factors, all of which are relevant. Some are more relevant than others, and some are more relevant in sort of the immediate circumstance that, if you kind of look at, lots of people have talked about this already, but if you look at the month or the 2 months prior to the launch of the special military operation, you will see there was this escalation of shelling Donbass that was not there when Minsk was sort of half-assedly being adhered to. So when you kind of see that escalation and the buildup of the Ukrainian troops backed by the official West, in that escalation of shelling, and you look at the sort of the graphs, it starts to make sense that something big is going to happen. We have to do something. And I know how a lot of people have pointed this out before, but I think it really makes sense to go back to that time, but also to look at the other factors and see how they interact with each other. But I think it's interesting that Putin brought up NATO's expansion to say, I'm not saying this was the trigger, the immediate trigger. I am showing you how over 30 years, promises have been made, people talked about our national security, and all of the stuff has been disregarded. And he claimed that repeatedly he tried to cooperate, whether by suggesting the crazy idea of what if Russia joins NATO, which to me is crazy because it makes no geopolitical sense. I mean, of course, at the same time, the existence of NATO makes no sense because it's a Cold War relic. But nonetheless, he sort of gave you all these examples of what he tried to do to de-escalate the rising tensions, to only show you that the other party was not interested in de-escalation.
Exactly, and the thing is that how the question is always put. It's not put like, oh, the NATO was slightly growing next to you. No, the expanding and everything. No, the question is, were you afraid that the United States would invade Russia? No, that was not what he said. That was not what he said, and he points out this again on this interview. No, this is, show me the clip where I say this exactly, because it's two very different things, and you can kind of play with words for the public, for the general public. You can but I said this and he said that's different. No, are two very different things, but very connected. Because I mean, look, if NATO just start putting nukes on the border of Poland, on the border on Ukraine, it doesn't mean it's going to use it, but it's going to have it. And that's a deterrence. That's a very strong deterrence because of the time of multiple, how's it called? The bilateral annihilation.
Mutually assured destruction, MAD. It's actually a Cold War. It's something that arose in the Cold War, right? That it's obviously still relevant because several countries, including Russia, are armed to the teeth with nukes. And the fact that perhaps in some cases, maybe that nuclear threat is exaggerated, but I feel it shouldn't be disregarded completely. And it seems like some, some segments of Western officialdom completely disregards that fact. And they just want to keep pushing and pushing and pushing to the point of no return. That's my opinion, but I know some people, some analysts share this opinion as well.
I mean, it doesn't matter. The thing is that they exist. The weapon exists, and it can be used. And we know that someone already used it. So it kinds of, in the psyche, in the human psyche, it kinds of breaks the taboo. So I already did it. Well,
right.
What if I do it again?
What if I do it again? Right.
It doesn't matter.
It's much more powerful and destructive now. But yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, it's a natural concern. It's a natural concern. I mean, the United States, it's putting bases everywhere in the planet outside of its home. So the excuse is that, we're going to fight there so they don't come here. Come on, nobody's going there since, 1500s.
It's an informal empire, so I think it's really kind of interesting how people claim that it's not, because it's not a physical control in the sense where there is that establishment of formal rule over another land. But of course, the informal control through weapons, through economic means, through media, etc., other types of soft power are very obvious. So when people say it's not the means of an empire because it's not a formal empire, it's really just laughable, again, in my opinion. But I'm just kind of curious what you...
Empire? You have to go to some kind of, tabulate and stamp some papers and, now I'm an empire.
Well, I think this is actually very interesting because I don't think a lot of people realize that this started before the U.S., way, way, way before the U.S. became a superpower after 1945. In the latter part of the 19th century, they started claiming all these little islands that were not inhabited. They had basically, pardon my French, bird poop that was used for fertilizer for agriculture. And that was the initial reason why they started claiming these islands. But of course, as weapons became more advanced, and in the context of World War II, those islands became more strategically important. So the idea of having these bases all over the world, now of course they're in actual, they're in third countries too, started with control of these little islands in the Pacific, where they were essentially initially getting fertilizer for a growing population in the U.S. in the 19th century. And I would actually, let me just check the name of that book, which I would recommend. You know what? I might have to just pop it in I just read it recently, but it's a great book on this subject by an American historian. And
we put the link in the description.
Yeah, we can definitely, and we can talk about this book separately as well. I think it sort of talks about that topic in more detail. But I'm now curious, going back to what we started with Putin essentially writing history and talking about history, because this is one of the objectives of this show, right, is to talk about historic events, but also the way they relate to modern politics. This is something that I'm interested in. This is something I've always been interested in, whether formally, academically, or informally. So I'm kind of curious what your take is from listening to his self-described long historic monologues about Russian history, starting from the baptism of Rus, as someone who's not Russian, who's not maybe familiar with some of these smaller key points.
Well, so first of all, the thing that most of the things that he said on this interview, we had discussed on the first and second. Well, not the first, because the first it was about the siege of Leningrad, but the second one we talked much about the orthodoxy as a strong bond on the Russian society, and not only in Russia, but also other societies around the area. And we had a show here with Lucas Leroche from the New Resistance, and he also spoke vastly about the orthodoxy, and to my humble opinion, I think Tucker was very smart on finishing the show at that moment, because nothing better from that would come after that last punch, when he talks about the brotherhood and the importance of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine uh, being connected to the Orthodox Church of Russia, and the importance of that for the people's bonds. And if you look, you can actually see Tucker was trying to hold the tears when he talks about that, because Tucker himself is also a well, Catholic or Christian of probably some American type of Christianity, but he's also a type of religious guy. So that was, I think that was very punchy for him. And so we had discussed that. We had discussed also some events, the formation of the Russian Empire and the big Russia. And that was, we also discussed this here, the fact that Ukraine, it's the name of the marginal people, the people that were living in the borders of.
Yeah, it's originally the term means the outskirts, and means the same thing, or there's a similar word in Polish too. So Polish people would refer to that land in the same way, Ukraina. I'm not sure I don't remember the Polish word for it right now, but it's similar to the Russian Ukraina. Yeah, that's definitely which again doesn't mean that if you start off as the outskirts, doesn't mean you can't have a modern country. Always have to go back to saying that. But when you are a modern country with multiple cultures and ethnicities that are sort of somewhat fused into each other, you really need to pursue a policy of some kind of federalization instead of reviving Nazi collaborationists from the 1930s and the early 1940s. That's probably not the best way to go about establishing a modern state, as our favorite gynecologist Ursula likes to talk about European values and how modern Ukraine is a model democracy. All of that stuff kind of gets ignored. So yeah, for sure. But do you feel like you've learned anything from Putin's lengthy lecture from the 9th grade mediocre textbooks, as criminologists would like you to believe?
Oh, for sure. I mean, if you are interested in what he's saying, for sure there is a lot to learn from that. And when I say it's that, because most of the things that he actually said, that I've been talking here with you, with Lucas, with even some other people. So for me, it was most of the things were not so new. So but it was, so if someone had.
But would you say you generally have the opinion, maybe ignoring some of the specific details, do you think generally history plays an integral role in informing modern events and modern politics? Or do you think it's sort of something that should be thrown out with, throw out the baby with the bathwater, kind of like what ideological liberals like to do? I think this actually really reflects the ideology of liberalism, or now I guess we could call it post-liberalism too, where there is this disregard for people's roots, kind of traditional roots, whether it's culture, religion, history, gender, et cetera, where there's complete deracination from things that from the structures and institutions that people have considered important to them for centuries, millennia, right? So I think the fact that some of these criminologists would laugh at the fact that Putin delved into this historic discussion actually says more about the ideology and just this complete perception of humans as a people, as not people that have a culture, a language, or religion community, but as sort of a real community, not a community like a subculture, right? Something that has been around for a long time, although many of these communities have eroded in the modern era. But it really kind of shows their perception of people as these autonomous human units that can sort of randomly adopt whatever identity, right, air quotes, that they want, whether it's today I'm this religion, tomorrow I'm that religion, or perhaps I can have 5 religions at the same time. I can change gender at will. I'm going to be a member of multiple subcultures. It's just, I'm kind of exaggerating, but it's sort of that idea where you also disregard history and the way it informs modern politics, international relations, and other other aspects of our life.
So I'm going to give you an example that I saw these days on Twitter. So it's Carnival now. This week it's Carnival time, and Brazil is very known by its Carnival. It's probably one of the most known on the planet. But
it's one of sort of the biggest celebration of its kind on the planet.
Exactly. It's a huge event for the entire country. So the thing was that some people, some of these new woke whatever people were saying, crazy things like, "Oh, the carnival only started because of the African slaves that were," and that's very, very stupid thing to say. I mean, the carnival today in Brazil, one of the biggest qualities to the most known carnival in Brazil, which is in Rio de Janeiro, a little bit in São Paulo. It's the samba and the samba schools and, the parade, all that thing, the contest. And that has very strong African roots. But the thing is that carnival here in Venice, a couple of kilometers away from me, it's probably millennial. And, the masks, one of the masks is the very known one with the big nose.
The plague doctor? The plague doctor?
Exactly, it's the plague doctor. They used to have that big nose to put some spices and things to purify the air so they would not get sick or sick by the sick.
Right.
So it's a very dangerous time right now where everybody's trying to rewrite history. So that's very dangerous per se. And I think history is very important, yes, to understand the current affairs and to also understand who we are. So we're starting this week, tomorrow actually, a project here in the channel, like the Winter Latina show, I think, but it's going to be monthly with Rafael Machado, who is the Brazilian who is translating Dugin's books, as you did in the US. And so
I only did one. And now I've been dubbed the translator, which is nothing wrong with that. But it's
books.
I know it's like the most evil thing you can do is to translate a book on philosophy. It's horrible. It's just pretty much like going after and killing kittens or something like that. But it's just I've been sort of dubbed as the translator, which like there would be nothing wrong with that, but I don't want to take credit from other people. And speaking of books, I did check the title. The book that I referred to is called How to Hide an Empire, and it's by Daniel Immerwahr, who is an American historian. So I think you people, the listeners here, would really find it interesting. It's also written really well. It's an interesting book. It's not a boring history book. Some of them might be more old school. It's an interesting read. But yeah, if you want to learn more about the history of the American empire from perhaps a surprising perspective, is definitely a book that you should check out. So there we go. How to Hide an Empire.
Please send me the link later.
It's on Amazon. It's you can download it everywhere. So it's on Kindle.
So this project with Rafael is going to be we call it like a milestone, zero milestone for a civilization. And this project started in my mind on our first show, not the Winter Latina, before that, the first time that we talk here, that I kind of put on the table the difficulty to describe Brazil as a civilization, and you kind of gave me a slap on the face, saying, no, Brazil does not fix as a civilization, but not in a bad way. It's just like you didn't say that exactly, but you said, you have to understand first if Brazil fits in the describing of a civilization. And that kind of made me think, and I said,
or
yeah,
whether
maybe
it needs to be considered in a broader South American context or not, right?
exactly,
I don't know enough
exactly.
about, I mean, I know sort of basics about Brazil and other sort of major countries on the continent, but
Yeah,
I wouldn't even dare classify or not classify Brazil as a civilization or not. But I think it's definitely a question worth exploring.
exactly,
Because
and
there are multiple
because
models of
it's
civilization, and like people usually think of Huntington,
mhm.
who had his Orthodox civilization that's sort of like Western Christian Europe. And then there's like the Asian, or China was kind of in its own category. But there are lots of other models going back to ancient Greece, and everyone had their own sort of idea and their own parameters as to how define a civilization and how these civilizations communicate with each other. So that's why I would not only not be equipped to describe Brazil, but also there are different models that you can use to do so. So
Yeah, but I didn't take that as offensive or whatever people may think. No, it just made me think, and I think you're absolutely right. Not only South American, but maybe Ibero-American,
yes,
which is the Iberic
Iberian, yeah,
Peninsula, which is not just Portugal, it's Portugal and Spain.
yes,
And maybe we can add there some African countries like Angola. So
sure,
the idea of this project is actually to sit down and start discussing, for example, as we did on our last show, the cultural
the religious
production,
history, yeah,
the
yes, the
cultural
cultural production.
the cultural productions of BRICS, but we discussed this in a Russian perspective, maybe in a BRICS perspective, but we are probably going to try to discuss this in a Brazilian perspective, a little
Right.
bit more, or South American, or Latin American, or Ibero-American perspective. So I think this is when I see, for example, the slavery, it's a very sad thing, and it's a big dark stain on our history. But hey, almost 50% of Brazilian population nowadays is it came from the slavery traffic.
Right.
So we cannot ignore the existence, or we cannot erase that from our history. We have to
Right.
learn to live with it. We have to learn to respect the people that came from that terrible thing. And we cannot simply say, I see in Brazil, I see this is very artificially try to push into Brazilian society this black and white, this racial division, like you see much clearly in the United States. And in Brazil, this is not a thing. I'm not saying that there is no racism. It's just not a thing. People
Right.
don't look you weird because of your skin color. It's not natural. People
Right.
may be racist, but they will not look you weird because of your skin color. That's very different. That's very different. It's hard to explain, and by no chance I'm excusing the racism that happens, that exists, and I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. It's just, so I think the point is that yes, it's extremely important to understand history. It's extremely important to know the history, but know it right.
Right.
And this is the thing about this channel. We are trying to bring perspectives from all over to build a better picture, not a perfect one, but a better one.
Right. Of course. Yeah. I mean, I think it's very important to work within, we always talk about this multipolar framework, to have that kind of cross-cultural communication and understand people's perspectives. And I think, some of your guests, not just me, have multiple locations where they've lived as well. So while I strongly associate with, with Russia, being Russian born, still having family there, I'm probably more plugged into Russian events, and I pay less attention to things that happen in North America. I mean, perhaps excluding some of the more obvious ones. Nonetheless, I've lived in North America for a long time. So you kind of also have that diaspora perspective as well. I mean, you yourself are technically, right, a diaspora, Brazilian diaspora in Europe. So I feel like that adds another layer to this understanding of history and being able to see things. Go ahead.
I'm much more complicated than that. I'm
Oh,
an European
even worse.
diaspora in Brazil, being a diaspora in Europe.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
It's yeah, because this is also a very interesting point as Brazilian. For us, the mixing, the race mixing, and the you know diasporical, I don't know if I said it right, mindset, it's much more clear and obvious
Sure.
because we know that nobody, well, nobody know, but we know that most of us in Brazil did not come from there, so
Sure.
it's very recent.
Would
It's
you
understandable.
make a parallel then with both Canada and the U.S. in that regard, where people have grandma from Italy, grandpa from Germany, or other places? Would you say it's sort of comparable in that sense?
It's not comparable. It's the same thing.
It's the same
Let's
thing. Yeah.
analyze this for a second. I
Hmm.
mean, you may take different immigrations, but it's the same thing. They have the
Hmm.
same age.
Hmm.
Columbus discovered America in
Sure.
1496, if I'm
Hmm.
correct, or 94, whatever. Uh,
92.
92. Okay, it was in the 90s, in the
In the
1490s.
in the 90s. You're like
In the
Putin now. It was
90s.
like it was in the 90s, the 1490s.
Right.
The
Exactly.
1490s, not the 90s.
Not these 90s.
Yeah, not these
And
90s.
Brazil, Cabral went to Brazil in 1500. So,
Hmm.
you know,
Sure.
a little bit here and there. So it's the same
Yeah,
thing.
would you say having this such large diasporic, I don't even know if that's a word, but that's the word you use, I'll use it too. Do you think that causes issues with a sense of rootedness when you know that so many of your family members came not just from one place, but from different places? And it's also kind of how do we establish our identity as people who have been born in a place, right? We're sort of from this place, and this is all we know until we move somewhere else. But we also know that our roots are from all over the place, and not even
But
from the same continent.
but that, I think, is the biggest strength of Brazilian, and I would say maybe
Hmm.
South American. And
Hmm.
that is there is no, I mean, I feel today, so okay, I'm Brazilian. I was born in Brazil. I speak Portuguese. I go to Portugal. I feel like home, okay?
Right,
It's
right.
not, and I'm Portuguese as
Hmm.
well.
Sure.
As a nation, I am Portuguese.
Hmm.
But I feel like home. I feel okay. I'm good there. I feel very comfortable. Talking yesterday with Nuno, he said the same thing. When I go to Brazil, I feel like home.
Right.
But, it's not the same.
Hmm.
If you would ask me, I would say no. I'm much more Brazilian. I lived my biggest part of my life in Brazil. I'm much more
Hmm.
Brazilian than Portuguese. What is the difference? Maybe none. Maybe a little in the
Hmm.
language,
Right.
But even in Brazil, you're gonna find so many different accents that
Hmm.
potato potato. So
Sure.
I think the fact that we accept this miscegenation and that we are from there, but we came from everywhere. I think the
Hmm.
fact that we accept that, or if we don't accept, we should start accepting this
Hmm.
better. This is the big one, probably one of the most strong roots of the Brazilian. You know,
I see.
uh, I live in Italy. Okay, Italians are very, very picky on food. So no ketchup on the pizza at all.
No American pizza. Thick
No,
crusted pizza, not accepted.
Domino's Pizza just closed 2 years ago. Closed entire country
That's
stores.
funny.
It closed everything. They went
I've
out.
only been to Italy once, but I have to say Italian pizza compared to attempts to even emulate Italian pizza in North America, even with thin crust and the proper ingredients, doesn't quite compare. So
No, no,
it's
no, no.
very
I mean,
different.
the food here
Very,
is
well, I guess we
amazing.
can be very purist about this. It's kind of like you go to a Japanese restaurant, even a good Japanese restaurant in North America, and go to like a cheap joint in Japan, you feel the difference. So
Yeah,
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 I understand
exactly.
what you're saying.
But us in Brazil, we are much more free on doing stuff. You know, we do. You just mentioned pizza. You just mentioned Japanese. Do you know that in Brazil you have those pizza go places where you have multiple flavors that just go
Oh,
around and you,
interesting. Okay.
yeah,
Oh, okay, like a
and
sushi
just like a
rotating person.
barbecue. Yeah, exactly. Rotating. Do you know that we have sushi pizza in some
Yes,
of these
I
places?
have read that you have sushi pizza. I have read about that. So
Yeah, so that's disgusting, but yet we can do it.
isn't
And
there some
nobody's
kind of
going
a
to be mad
chocolate?
in
Isn't there
Brazil.
some kind of a chocolate pizza that I've read
Oh,
about? Was
yeah.
it Brazil or some other place?
Oh,
I read
no,
about a
yeah, yeah.
chocolate pizza and it looks really disgusting, but maybe it's really good because it's chocolate. So
It's actually good.
right.
That is good. Well, ice cream
What
pizza,
do
I
you
mean,
think? What do you think
M&M
Putin
pizza.
would think about chocolate pizza to bring it back to the tyrant?
Who?
Do you think
Who?
the
Putin,
tyrant Putin? Do you
the
think he'd
tyrant.
like yeah, the tyrant trademark TM? Do you think tyrant who lives in Mordor? Do you think he would appreciate a chocolate pizza from Brazil?
Maybe I don't think he would appreciate chocolate pilmeni, but that's different stuff.
Chocolate filmini, yeah, that's definitely going to be an insult not to be that you cannot come back from. You might be thrown out the window, as criminologists like to claim. Actually, one more thing, I did find it interesting that in his reaction to the reaction, he did mention Assange because people were wondering why did he not mention Assange in the original interview. So I think he actually may have forgotten because he really wanted to drive that point forward in his. Are we even allowed to mention his name on social
I
media? I'm
don't
not
care.
sure.
I'm going. And
Right,
if
but
you
so I
want,
thought
I'll
I
put
thought it
some
was actually
hashtags here on the screen. Big
right
hashtag.
to bring it back to the or the original topic of discussion. I thought it was interesting that he clearly felt strongly enough to bring up that subject whenever Russia is being accused of this or that, and you have this man imprisoned in a third country in the UK in conditions of a medieval torture chamber, and I thought the fact that he made a point with this Russian journalist that I am going to talk about this. He clearly sort of had his list of, okay, we're going to talk about the Kiev in 1905. We're going to talk about the Annalina's Nazi grandpa, and we're going to talk about Assange. So he kind of had his list of the things I wanted to bring up in a more hostile interview, and I didn't. So I'm going to go through them. So that was one of the points. I thought it was really interesting that he did mention it.
So
Although
one
fewer
point,
people would see it, but
yeah.
nonetheless.
No. I'm going to put on my Twitter, and then another 300
And then
people
it's
are
just
going
going
to
to
see it.
explode, right?
No, but one thing that I missed on the interview, on the original interview with Tucker, was exactly when Tucker brings up the subject of that journalist. I forgot his name.
The Washington
And,
Post, Dershowitz, yes.
yeah, Gershowitz or something like that. Yes. And what I missed was because he comes with this, superhero that, oh, let me bring the boy home and everything like that. He's just 32 and all that. And first of all, I like that Putin was very firm. Okay, you're not going to push me to do that here just because we are, live
But
TV or
I think it
whatever.
also shows that Putin did have some hostile questions, right? I mean, why didn't this get censored? So I mean, that just shows you that there were some topics that were
And
more challenging for him to address, right? So
and he explained that. He explained, oh, no. He's not just a journalist in jail. But what I missed was the fact that there was very strong and fast discussions to release the basketball player.
sure.
And they exchanged the basketball player for the merchant of
The
death.
arms, yeah, the
What's the name?
arms
The
dealer,
Victor
yes,
Boot. Yeah.
who's been kidnapped from a third country, which is a separate, very interesting story.
The guy has a movie with Nicolas Cage.
Right. He's famous in that way. When you've made it to the Nicolas Cage level, you've definitely made it. There's really no higher ground to cover in this sense. Yeah. So that was it's definitely that particular situation with a basketball player resolved itself a lot sooner.
Very
I think
fast.
that a lot of people
Before the guy.
expected. Right, exactly. So there's, but I mean, it also shows you that there are certain diplomatic channels that are always open, and that there's some behind the scenes communication that most of us mere mortals are not privy to. And that even though there is this dissolution of the relationship between the official West and in Russia, there's still that communication happening, and hopefully more of it can happen so that more common ground sort of on bigger issues can be found, not these prisoner exchanges, but something bigger, like, you know, like hint, the war in Ukraine, to resolve itself at some point before we die. That would be nice. So yeah, I think that's kind of a smaller but a hopeful sign from that interview.
Yeah, and so from the your what's it called, post? I'm not, post is the wrong name. The
article.
The article.
Sure.
Is much better name, exactly. You already mentioned here before on this conversation about the situation about the ideology, and you know, communism, liberalism, fascism, and liberalism survived.
Sure.
And all this, you know, left, right, you know, white, red, becoming obsolete. And that comes to me to ask you about exactly about Dugin, that we also brushed here before, about the fourth political theory. What do you think about that? And I have one small question later, but I would like to maybe finish with that.
Sure. Well, so first of all, the article you're referring to is something I wrote in 2015. So it's
2015,
almost 10 years old, right? So it was my reaction to the war in Donbass that has since then escalated to the war in Ukraine. So I always have to correct people who said the war started in 2022. We have to correct them and say, no, it actually started in 2014, because what's been going on in Donbass is very much real, especially if you've been watching it unfold in real time. So the point of that article was to show you how there's civil wars are very complex things, right? And so you can look at different countries. You can look at the American Civil War, how it's still a topic of discussion in the context of, let's say, its history of slavery, but also some other issues with the differences between states in the North and the South, et cetera, sort of beyond the point of this conversation. But the Russian Civil War is kind of similar in that regard, because generally it was a much more complex situation than reds versus whites, but usually that's how it's portrayed. And so there's some segments of Russia society that would mostly associate themselves, of course, with the revolutionary people who eventually established the Soviet Union, but others, sort of a smaller percentage, would perhaps claim themselves to be monarchists. So it's kind of this issue that has been resolved, but maybe not completely resolved. And so when I wrote this article, I was looking at the way that some monarchists were participating, people with, self-described views that would sort of be maybe not necessarily anti-Soviet, but very pro sort of late imperial Russia. And then you had people who were explicitly very much invested in Soviet history, and how those the two groups were cooperating in the context of this, the Donbass militias and the sort of popular struggle against the Kiev regime, in my opinion. I always have to preface things with, in my opinion, even if it's factual, because we are on various social media platforms and in countries that may not like factual information, you know what I mean? So yeah, so I kind of wanted to talk about the way that those not fully resolved grievances were sort of resolving themselves in this new conflict through this cooperation, which in some ways was very surprising, because you would see sort of flags with Christian symbols, but at the same time, these people would be very much invested in Soviet history, which, people would think, oh, how is this even possible that you have a flag with Christ, an Orthodox flag with Christ, and at the same time you are sort of this pro-Soviet person, et cetera, et cetera. So that was sort of the point of this article. But to go back to your question, I have never actually met Dugin, even though I haven't been to Moscow in a while because of all the things that have been going on. But there was an opportunity where I could have met him. We had never met him, so I've never actually communicated with him beyond me translating a couple of articles and then translating a single volume of his book. And the book was on philosophy. It was not on ideology. It was not on geopolitics. It was a legitimate book on Martin Heidegger. So it's been very interesting for me, and perhaps naive, to have put my name on it and then have this witch hunt against me, painting me as this evil disseminator and the evil translator. God forbid we translate information that people can themselves judge because they have no brain. They can't judge information for themselves. This is how these critics think about their general population as being complete brain dead zombies. So yeah, and since then I've been sort of dubbed as the translator, even though I've only done a couple of articles as a volunteer for my own personal interest. And also I've translated many things, right? When I did my dissertation, I've translated Communist Party documents that were relevant to my research. That doesn't mean I'm agreeing with every single thing that I'm translating here or translating there. I'm translating because I'm trying to make accessible things that may not be accessible, right? Mm-hmm. So now obviously in today's day and age with Google Translate or other auto-translate programs, it's a little bit more accessible for you to jump on some website and auto-translate, and it might come out understandable, it might not, but yeah, so it's just the way that you're kind of boxed into this category of you're this type of person if you do this. And obviously it also kind of intrigued me and made me laugh at the way that they selected that one particular person because he's bearded and he looks in a certain way, when they're much more, let's say, maybe not, I don't think extreme is a good word, but much more militant people in sort of the Russian intellectual spectrum that have said more militant things, but they're completely ignored, and they just zoomed in into this one intellectual, which has always been very interesting to me, that this was clearly a part of not something objective, but more of a propaganda campaign to show, oh, look, this crazy bearded guy, look at what he said 30 years ago when he was 20 years old, even though his opinions might have changed 20 times. We can judge by what we said when we're 18 and 20 versus what we think now, right? So it's kind of that same thing. But going to the question of the fourth political theory, I think it's something that was released more than 10 years ago. It was something that was issued as a call to a discussion, right? Mm-hmm. So what we're sort of living in these times where it seems that the global reach of the two modern ideologies, communism, fascism, has waned. And there's only one that has remained, liberalism. Some people would make the point that it's actually transformed into what some have called post-liberalism. But it's an ideology that has been very damaging in many ways. And so what do we do now? How can we surpass this? How can we be more in line with the logos of our cultures and our histories and our countries? How can we bring back this more traditional way of life without going to live in a mud hut? How do we reconcile living in a technological age, but at the same time not subscribing to an ideology that has been damaging in ways that are more perhaps insidious, as opposed to, like it's easy to look at fascism because it was kind of a short-lived global ideology. Obviously, it still exists in small, on a smaller scale, but as far as having a global reach, it's more of a tool right now for, the way that the official West supports the Kiev regime. You can say, well, it's a tool, right? Much like moderate rebels in the Middle East are a tool for the people who would themselves say they subscribe to liberal ideology with all the nice terms about democracy and freedom, while engaging in some less than nice, right, endeavors. And so, yeah, the idea of the fourth political theory was an invitation to a discussion of where do we go from here. So I'm not really sure if we've advanced that far from that point more than 10 years ago, because we're still living in this insane liberal environment where some of the things that were sort of budding are now fully blooming, and they're even more insane. I think we all know what types of things we're talking about as far as the culture war is concerned. Some people think culture wars are irrelevant, but I don't think so. I think they are quite relevant because they're just one of the expressions of this ideology that has also expressed itself in, let's say in NATO, for instance, with nice slogans, and then the undercurrent is really not so nice. So yeah, I mean that's sort of what I have to say about it. It was kind of this open-ended philosophy of let's contribute and let's brainstorm where can we go as the world, right? Not just Russians, not just South Americans, as Europeans, but as the world. How can we get out of this predicament?
Yeah, that was when we had Rafael Machado here in the channel. That was the as someone that studies the fourth political theory. That was the impression that I had, who never studied it before. And I was actually quite amazed by the fact that Doug in Brazil and in Europe, he's seen like a far right guy, or all these labels that they like to put on people that are not them.
Well, there is just this cherry picking going on from things that might have been said in 1989. And then they're going to pick something that was said in 2014 and they're going to splice it together and show you, oh my God, this is awful. But if you were to do this to anyone, it's going to have a similar effect because people's views change, people make different arguments. I mean, you can make an equally reasonable argument that he's very far left as far as sort of having social justice economically, having sort of more of a fair system of access and social welfare. You can make an equally strong argument that he is far left, right? So, and I think that shows the way that the current political compass is outdated. If you're sort of the same person can be painted as this and that, and these two things are completely in contrast to each other. He's a fascist. No, he's a Nazi. No, he's a communist. And how can you put all of those together? Well, it's because you don't quite understand. Well, first of all, you don't quite understand ideology. You're just using kind of labels instead of going to the root of what each ideology may have meant and what the sort of the focal point of each ideology was. You're also engaging in propaganda, but also it shows you that there are limits to subscribing to, let's say, one party's platform in, country A. It doesn't have to be America, it doesn't have to be Germany, whatever, right? So it just kind of shows you that the limits are much, much more significant than they would have been, 50 years ago.
Yeah, the thing is that the political debate got extremely stupid and limited at a level that is just, white versus red, left versus right. And we just need to expand. We just need to go back at least to some debate on the sphere of
political. I normally think in systems, and I normally think of from a very broad perspective. And then of course, yes, you can go down and look at detail. So sometimes when people are debating certain things, to me, it's like, well, one does not negate the other, much like I was saying earlier. These things can be reconciled in a certain way. So I kind of feel like I'm always thinking systemically, not always, often. And so and then I just have to realize that not everyone thinks in this way. Some people are sort of bogged down in a kind of more minutia type content, and perhaps it's deliberate. It's probably easier to keep people occupied and angry at more minutia type content, as opposed to broader. So if you look at the modern left in the West, they're more concerned about gender questions than they're concerned about workers' rights. There's really not much of the original left that was more conscious of class and economic issues that are very relevant in the age of inflation and sending billions of dollars to foreign countries rather than, improving infrastructure and funding healthcare at home in many countries, not just one. And so, so it's all kind of cosmetic in this sense. So I think that's also problematic, where people are just very, very much within these parameters rather than expanding the parameters to kind of a broader systemic view, and then understanding that some things are naturally resolved, but other things are, they're definitely worth questioning. So, but that's a topic for another. That's a topic for another
Sure, sure.
discussion.
I'll just leave an example here. Was reading a news yesterday about Congo in some African newspaper, and they were talking about Congo's going to ask reparations for that many years, so France will have to pay. Well, what if France just say no? What are you going to do? You're going to invade France?
Right.
So this is the kind of debate that it's not going to have a solution. So let's not talk about that right now, at least. Maybe later.
I think that was the same situation with Poland asking Germany for reparations. It was more of a political move as opposed to something that would have had tangible outcomes. So I think there is also this game that's being played in terms of the domestic voting blocks, right? Who is listening, and it kind of gets really more complicated in that sense. So,
yeah. So we just reached 1.5 hours. I think we can wrap it up here, or do you have anything else that you think?
No, I think this is a good point to wrap it up. I would recommend for our audience, if they haven't seen Putin's reaction to his own interview, which again sounds hilarious to me. Yeah, and I think it might be actually longer than the clips that we have seen. But yeah, definitely go check it out because you're going to get some additional information that wasn't part of the original interview. I would also recommend watching other interviews because this by no means is the sort of the mother load. It's just, it was pretty good. It wasn't the best one that I've seen, but at the same time, I think Putin always performs quite well in these environments, whether they're hostile or friendly. So I think we'll have a lot more to say. I don't think this is the last we're going to hear of it, basically. Yeah. We might have to jump back in thinking like, oh my God, it's been 5 months. We're still talking about this. This is unbelievable, but it might actually happen. So thank you for watching, everyone.
Maybe he accepts my invitation and comes to the IDM channel.
Well, now that he sees my dark Mordor Moscow t-shirt, he's definitely. I mean, how can you resist the the dark Moscow, the evil Kremlin? With all that's missing is like a red light coming out of the St. Basil's. That was actually funny in the mid 2000s when you saw all this anti-Russian propaganda. They would show St. Basil's, which is like a church, and they would say it's the Kremlin, and then they would have this red light coming out of it, but it wasn't even the Kremlin. So that shows you the level of Kremlinology in some parts of the official West. It leaves much to be desired.
I'm going to ask you this because the preview, the teaser for the interview that Tucker did, he says, we have the Kremlin here in the back. But is that red building the Kremlin?
Well, I didn't see the teaser. So the red building, what some children call the Candy Castle, is the St. Basil's Cathedral. But the red square is like a big, it's a big area with multiple buildings. There are multiple historic churches there, and of course the Kremlin. So it's definitely, you wouldn't say the Kremlin referring to a church, is my point. But if you talk about the red square, then I think it's okay to say we're at the red square and you can have a church in the back. But yeah, I haven't seen I don't remember.
In the back, but
I know.
It's always
here. It's always in my heart. It's on my t-shirt. Well, no, it's not on my t-shirt. It's St. Basil's that's on my t-shirt. Wait a second. It's not even the Kremlin. Yeah, there you go. So thank you for watching, guys. Hopefully you have something to say in the comments. I love to read them and see, especially if you disagree with me and challenge me to a debate. And we will see you, Tech Genius Marcelo and talking head Nina. We'll see you I can't believe I'm talking about myself in the third person. We'll see you soon, basically.
Next week.
I need caffeine. Yes.
Good idea.
Thank you, guys.
Next week, next Thursday, we're back. Tech Genius is going to apologize because the image of Nina's camera was not the best today, but I'm going to work on that. Next time is going to be better. Thank you, everybody. See you next Thursday. Bye-bye.
Oh, my goodness. That was a long one.
It was about the same as the
before.
last one.
It was not as long as your...
I just didn't stop on 1 hour, and let me see. Still, okay.
It wasn't as long as my discussion with you and your Brazilian.
No, that was 4 hours.
That was like 3 hours, right?
4.
4. Oh my goodness, that was even worse.
That was even worse. Yes, that was. It still holds the record of the channel.
Is that the longest blah blah?
Yeah, it's the longest because you had Carl Zad the other day almost got you. He stood here 3 hours talking about Uyghurs.
Oh my gosh. Which is another. You know what would be very interesting? I don't even know if they're gonna let us through. But I always felt that. Do you remember how maybe more before they really launched the Uyghur campaign, the anti-China campaign, they had the whole trope of gay concentration camps in Chechnya, and that never really took off. It was a little bit. I mean, there was like a bunch of articles, evil Chechens. I feel like that was like a test to then take the concentration camp idea and then apply it to China. I feel like they kind of did this test on. So I feel it would be kind of interesting